Good evening and welcome to the George Eastman Museum. I'm so pleased to have this audience here tonight. I'm Jamie Allen. I'm the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Curator in the Department of Photography here at the Eastman Museum. I'd like to start this evening by remembering that the George Eastman Museum resides within the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Onondaga. I said it wrong, so I'm going to try again. I've been practicing. Onondaga, there you go, Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill, known in English as the Seneca people. Specifically, the museum occupies land ceded in the 1788 Phillips-Gorham Purchase, which was procured under false pretenses, duress, and coercion. We pledge to honor and better serve the indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty, history, cultures, and experiences. The Eastman Museum is committed to sharing and amplifying diverse voices with our collection, exhibitions, programs, and interpretation. And we hope that you take time after tonight's lecture to visit our gallery spaces, which will be open until 8 p.m. And if you see something down there that you have questions about, I'm happy to answer questions for you. I'm pleased to be introducing Adam Ekberg this evening. His exhibition, Adam Ekberg, Minor Spectacles, is on view in the museum's project gallery through September 3rd. I've had the privilege of getting to know Adam over the last decade as we worked together on an essay about his work for the Society of Photographic Education's magazine Exposure, which was published in the fall of 2016. And then we proceeded towards working towards the exhibition that's on view now. Adam Ekberg began making constructed photographs more than a decade ago. His photographs of displaced and misused objects create photographs that, in abstract and absurdist ways, visualize commonalities within the human condition, namely temporality, ephemerality, presence, and absence. Ekberg received his MFA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago in 2006. His first monograph, The Life of Small Things, was released by Waltz Books in November 2015. And I'm going to hold it up here because it's a really beautiful book. It comes in a lovely slipcover. And Adam's going to be signing copies of the book after the lecture tonight. So again, join us down by the exhibition so you can have your very own copy signed. Ekberg received numerous awards, including the Society for Photographic Education's Image Maker Award in 2015, the Tanay Foundation Award in 2013, a University of South Florida Researcher Grant, and several Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs grants. He's held residencies at the Playa Residency Program as well as Yaddo. Ekberg has guest taught at institutions such as the California College of Arts, Rutgers, and the Maryland Institute College of Art. And he's currently teaching an asynchronous class online, so if you are a teacher out there and want to talk about that scenario, he's open to that too. Ekberg's work has been exhibited in many solo exhibitions at galleries, but the Eastman Museum is honored to mount his first solo exhibition at a United States art museum. Ekberg's work is held in several public collections, including the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, and Indiana University Art Museum in Bloomington, as well as numerous private collections. And I'll note that we're proposing to add several works from the exhibition to the Eastman Museum collection next week, so I'm confident that Adam's work will be listed as it being in our collection very soon. But enough of that. You're not here to have me talk to you. You're here to have Adam Ekberg tell you about his work. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Adam Ekberg.
All right. Thank you so much, Jamie, for the amazing introduction and all your help leading up to this exhibition. It's been a fun journey along the way. And thank you to Amy and Emma for both their help with preparing for this presentation tonight. And all the team members at George Eastman for, I'm losing track of it now, but the many months, depending on how you count it, or in some instances, a couple years of getting this together. It's really been fun. It's been a wonderful journey. And really want to thank my family and friends, a lot of which have come, I was going to say from near and far, but really everyone's kind of come from far. So I want to thank everyone coming in so many different ways. There's so many different kinds of support I've had, from physically assisting me in photographs to making food for me while I was trying to do things, to helping me be a parent while I could apply for things. So yeah, thank you for everyone for making it out. And so what I want to do tonight is I'm going to go through some images. I'm going to talk about my process, and I wanted to start off, I'll do a little reading in the beginning, and I'll kind of drift away from that, but just sort of to ground myself. So in my practice, I make images that attempt to convey transcendence through modest means, firmly grounded in photography yet lean on sculpture, performance, and time-based experiences. My photographs begin as sketches, and I do whatever is necessary to make the imagined event occur. This has led me to develop some idiosyncratic skill sets that I'll only use once, such as generating an eclipse by throwing a pineapple in the air, or creating a basic catapult to launch a lawn chair over the plains of the Midwest. My process is a game with very specific rules. The event must be generated by me. There can be no augmentation. The camera is merely a witness to the happenings. The resulting photograph must mirror the original drawing. My studio walls are covered with sketches, and it always feels like a small victory when I replace a sketch with a small print of an actualized event. So I'm just going to kind of walk through the pragmatics of making one image. This is my studio. It's a little barn in New Jersey that looks out over a small forested area. So it doesn't really have, it's sort of a conceptual space. It doesn't really have the things you expect of photography. There's no computers or darkrooms. It's a space to sit and make drawings. And you can see in the back right, there are a lot of my drawings pinned to the wall. And then, as I sort of said, when I actually make the photograph that emulates that drawing, it'll be replaced by the photograph. This is a detail of that. So the drawings are the things yet to be realized, and then the photographs are the ones that have replaced the drawing that was there previously. And the drawings are really not precious. I occasionally have my friends who are painters say that they're great. I know they're being nice. But they're mostly little sketches and ways to sort of model a way a photograph can be made, and they're sort of stand-ins for the photograph until the photograph can be actualized. And to illustrate their lack of preciousness, I mean, sometimes they're in a notebook like the previous slide, other times they're on, like a lot of people, and receipts or on scraps of paper. And this is one where I drew for this image I'm about to show, where I had come up with this idea that I was going to drag a trampoline to a space I thought would be in the Midwest. It ended up being a field in New Jersey where I got access to. Initially, I thought I was going to drop a pineapple on it. It was going to be this wondrous moment where alone in this landscape there was a pineapple leaping from a pink trampoline. And then for various reasons, mostly involving weight, I found that wasn't going to work. So I came along with an indelible marker and just simply wrote, pumpkin. And then they become, I don't have outtakes from the shoot because it was during the pandemic. It was just my friend and neighbor across the street helping me, so there's no way really to document it. One of us had the task of throwing things, the other had the task of photographing. But they become a piece of film. So we go to this location, we drag all these things out, and they become a series of pieces of film in hopes that one of them will function as the resulting image. This is my neighbor. He's taller and faster than me. He's basically a gazelle. And so for that reason, he was in charge of pumpkin throwing and running. And it being late season, the pumpkins, there were not a lot of them left. So this is a particularly small one. And this is a frame that failed. He was still in the frame, but occasionally that happens. And then ultimately, this was the resulting one that worked. So we tried a variety of different techniques, from bouncing it off the trampoline itself to lobbing it in the air and having it land, which I think is, I believe, what we ended up doing in the end. And this is the final image that's in the show down the hall. So this is the quick map of this talk forward. I'm going to tell, just so I want to kind of stay on point, and I want you all to understand kind of why I'm doing this. I'm going to tell a few stories that function as keystone experiences inform my interests. I'm going to talk about games, a discussion of games, including chess and Go, and how they overlap with my art practice. And part 3 is images, a sampling of images that illustrate this journey and relate to both stories and games. Part 1 Stories. So this is an image taken, this is like the aftermath of my first childhood memory when I was 4 years old. And so in the late 70s into the early 80s, in the town I grew up in, there was a serial arsonist that was running around burning all the barns. And this is one of those things, it's very pre-internet, obviously. It really probably never even made national or even local news. But it was sort of became like kind of town lore. And if I meet people that are my age and older, definitely, like it's a thing that like a lot of people will remember. It just so happened that my parents, our house, the house I grew up in, was just out of frame left here. In fact, if you look kind of in the bottom left frame, you can see a box, which was that was my sandbox. And so the serial arsonist was going around, and it was sort of understood in my family. It wasn't a matter of if, but just when, that this would happen. So my family, unbeknownst to me, as I was a small child, had sort of prepared for this. My mom had, I guess, photo albums underneath the bed, ready to grab and take out should the barn be lit on fire. And they had put various things in place, so I guess we could get out quickly. I was unaware of all this, and a lot of these stories become sort of family lore. Like I've heard my father stood out in his pajamas and sprayed the side of our house to try to keep it from burning. But what I remember, and the thing that's like sort of separate from all those things is this like unique memory, which is simply mine, is my mother ran out the door of my sister and I was taken out to the street, and I was held in the arms of, I remember as a stranger, I'm sure it was like someone from down the road, and I was held by this person as the night sky just filled with this like fantastic fire. It could be seen, people counted, it could be seen 15, 20 miles away. It filled the night sky, and I was wearing this like my most favorite pair of spaceship pajamas, the kind that have the feet on them. And I was held, and I watched this fire fill the sky, and then someone came by and gave me a glow stick. And so I held this glow stick, and I watched the fire fill the night sky, and I think it made this imprint on me in a bunch of different ways, both I'd say like aesthetically, I think as far as phenomena go, and also just this experience of being really small in the universe, and the universe being very, very big. And so I only realized this, a lot of these things I'm talking about, there wasn't things I set out to do, but I just think the way I make work is I make things and then I look back and I sort of realize them only afterwards. So, 30 some odd years after that experience, being a small child and having that happen, upon looking at work in my studio, I had the realization that my process mirrored that of the arsonist. That, the arsonist, who would come and place a candle in a barn and then would escape out to sort of blend himself into the audience to watch the resulting fire. And I guess I should say that the reason the way he was caught was the fire department would make photographs and they would look for someone who reappeared at every scene. And ultimately this person was the one face that appeared in all those photographs. But I found myself doing the same thing. I found myself going to a place, I found myself making something happen for my enjoyment, to see it and to see it actualized in the world, but for obviously completely different ends. I do a lot in my practice when using actual fire to prevent it from ever being problematic. I have a fire extinguisher, I have a shovel, but I found myself looking back at me as sort of informed also by that, following some sort of model there. And the beauty of going somewhere to make something happen, and it's also maybe the beauty of sort of being with an illuminated object. And then my next story, number 2, and there's kind of mostly just 2 and a couple other little anecdotes, but in my mid-20s, I moved back to Portland, Maine, a town near and dear to my heart, and I was looking for a job, and any job, like a pay-the-rent job. And so I was, Portland at the time at least was a place that had a lot of sort of social services and a lot of customer service was the sort of 2 buckets I guess they were falling into. And so, on a given day, I probably applied for a landscaping job in a deli and a coffee shop. And it just so happened, I don't even remember actually applying because I was just trying to do anything, but I got a job down the street from where I lived as a certified registered medical assistant at a 6-bed facility for people with HIV and AIDS. A job that I had really never sought out, I didn't see myself doing. And after a surprising small number of contact hours in a course, I found myself doing. And so the job was mostly really banal. It was a lot of taking care of people. It was a lot of cooking food for six. It was a lot of passing a lot of medication. And it mostly was that. That was the tenor of the job. But especially after a certain hour when the sort of admin staff went home and the nurses went home, you were the only person there. And on a couple of occasions, I was with someone when they passed away, which is an experience that ultimately changed me a lot. And so during that time, I found myself doing this job, and there's several documentary photography projects that were made on residents at that space. And they didn't really sit right with me, and I'd say that they underscored a lot of things with photography that maybe I was having a hard time with. The person taking the photographs was in power, and regardless of whether there was a consensual agreement agreed, the person who was being represented didn't really have much say in the matter, and the way they were represented, maybe I didn't like. I felt like it would reduce people perhaps to some sort of cliche. And so I started thinking about how I could do that differently, and that feeling of that in-betweenness of being someone at the end of their life seemed like way too important to be, rendered that way. So I started first off by removing people completely. That was step one. And I started making these photographs at funeral homes in the greater Portland, Maine area, and just making these incredibly formal pictures. I'd get access to these spaces, I'd go in with lights, and I treated them all the same. I try to keep the camera subject distance to it's called the bier, the place where the casket goes. I'd try to keep it the same. And I tried to make a documentation of the absence and presence as mediated through this sort of formal space. And in the end, I was kind of happy with them. Certainly, formally, I thought they were pretty great. And they did none of the things I wanted them to do. And so that was another learning that this wasn't quite it. So about this time, I moved from Maine. I moved to Chicago for graduate school, and I started to think how can I rethink this further or break it down? And there was no real great thought process, but I drove back to Maine, and I don't even know if this is exactly what I was trying to address at the time, but I drove back to Maine, and I had this disco ball, and I got a car battery to a power inverter to a smoke machine, and a flashlight from Home Depot that makes 2 million candles of luminosity. And I grabbed my friend, and we started going into the wintry landscape of Maine, mostly up this small mountain I've been going up since I was a kid. And so we'd go up that just before dusk and set the situation up. And like I said in the beginning, my images can have no augmentation. So I can't have footsteps in there, so I have to figure out a way to get into this image. I have to figure out a way to be able to hang this disco ball. I have to figure out which way the wind currents are going so the smoke will just float in just so. And ultimately, this is the image that we made. Which I felt came a lot closer to the experience of being with someone at the end of their life. And I felt like I really kind of tapped into this non-visual experience of presence and absence that I was sort of after. And then these things, I guess, pop up in other ways, in much more minor ways. And I think that became also the thing. I think maybe this was the keystone experience, but how could I access it? And I found that things that were absurdist and things that were light were maybe the best way. Kind of the way comedy, I think, sometimes can address the most hard to discuss things. I think maybe working a different way of absurdity was a way that I could sort of get at that through a different channel. So this is the most literal example of making a photograph where I actually sort of represented what I saw. And this is not the standard one, but I was walking with my dog. I was walking through a field, and this cluster of helium balloons just flew overhead. And it was really just struck by that moment. I mean, it's not really a significant moment in one's life. And for some reason, for me, it just felt so good. And immediately, I sort of thought of the hands from which those helium balloons had slipped. Obviously, it's not a good idea to let balloons go and have the plastics dissipate into the oceans, as we all know. But in a more magical realism way, I sort of wondered where they would go. And I sort of felt them in their drift. So I didn't have a camera, so I went about restaging this event and making it happen with an assistant, releasing these and then making a photograph of them drifting over a forest. Another story, and these last couple are really brief. It was a very different time in my life when I was living with some friends outside of Taos, New Mexico, in a van we all shared. And two of which are here tonight, which I'm really psyched about. And we were sort of out in the mountains and just being young and foolish. And like, I don't know, a couple times a week, once a week, would go into Taos to get groceries. And there was this amazing experience where we'd like come from Taos, a place that at least at the time had very little terrestrial radio, and we would drive out in the mountains, and I'd just turn the old knob of the terrestrial radio, and I'd feel all the radio stations go away until they were all gone. And there was this moment, again, a totally non-visual experience, in which there was nothing but static, and we were left in this sort of like beautiful emptiness of silence. And the last sort of anecdotal story, having to sort of trying to get at what this feeling is, this like non-visual experience. On the very lake where this photograph of a sparkler was made, there was this night, and I just was sitting out in a canoe by myself, just floating. And I was floating in the lake, and there was just one cabin light on the opposite side of the lake. And I was watching it, and there was a moment where someone just turned it off. And then I was left in like just total darkness with this huge sky full of stars above me. And then that moment I felt both like the absence of the light, which made me also like think about the presence of the person who had just flipped off the switch. Part 2 games. The philosopher Bernard Suits says playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And I think no truer words can be said, and not to misuse this quote, but I also like very much relate to my art practice as a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And a friend and assistant of mine, when things go really wrong and I'm getting extremely frustrated with this process I've laid out, is quick to point out to me, you designed it this way. And when I was thinking about games and the relationship of my love of games, and I should say I'm going to talk about Go and chess sort of briefly and just sort of surface level analysis. I also love games like bocce ball and cube. So I love all games, both cerebral and other. But I guess I'm talking about chess and Go tonight. This book I've been loving for a long time has to do with the relationship Marcel Duchamp had with the game of chess. And it's this sort of half-truth that the last third of his life he'd given up art for chess, which isn't really real. He was making the étant-donné the whole time. But he did become like a very serious chess player. And he was playing in New York City and in Paris and Buenos Aires where he was living, and giving a lot of his time over to that. And so this quote by Julian Levy says, Duchamp said it wasn't a war game, it's an aesthetic game. And then Edward Lasker, who is an international master, and also is kind of responsible, is one of the people that brought Go over, one of the first Westerners to write about Go, so it was the first texts about Go in English were written by Lasker, said Duchamp was a master amongst amateurs who would always take risks in order to play a beautiful game rather than being cautious and brutal to win. Which I think gets at the ideas laid out in the book, Games, Agencies, Art, by C.T. Nguyen. And I really love this idea in this quote, and I think it sort of speaks to a lot of things about Duchamp and chess. In striving play, the goal and purpose are askew. An achievement player plays to win. A striving player acquires temporarily an interest in winning for the sake of the struggle. Thus, striving play involves a motivational inversion from ordinary life. In ordinary practical life, we pursue means for the sake of the ends, but in striving play, we pursue the ends for the sake of the means. We have then the capacity to submerge ourselves in a temporary agency and thereby create layers of motivational states. In striving play, the inner layer involves taking on motivations to succeed in the game's terms to win. The outer layer involves those motivations which brought us to play the game in the first place, an interest in aesthetics, fun, fitness, or whatever. And so I guess it's no coincidence in my studio I play a lot of Go online. When I don't know what to do, that's my that's the thing I kind of go to. And much like chess, I think it's a space where experiments happen and lessons are learned. And I think it's a space where, like especially in Go, it's impossible to play that game without seeing your own fallibilities, without seeing if you're too greedy or you're being too timid or if you're being too attacking. And so I think it's like a beautiful mirror back at yourself. And Edward Lasker said, the rules of Go are so elegant, organic, and rigorously logical that if intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe, they would almost certainly play Go. which, if nothing else, the image of aliens playing Go is pretty awesome. And to kind of round this off, if you were to get into a game like Go, there's a couple texts that are really kind of in the canon. This series by James Davies, and one's called Life and Death. And baked into the game is this sort of existential struggle. And so I think of it both as a creative space and a space in which you explore notions of life and death through the way that your stones move. And then I think of this kind of this way. In terms of games, my inner layer, taking C.T. Nguyen's idea of inner and outer layer of motivations. My inner layer takes on the motivations to win the game as dictated by the rules of Go, whereas my outer layer involves an interest in aesthetics, finds creative moves, and focuses on the notion of non-attachment and emptiness. Whereas in art, I think, my inner layer takes on the motivations to win the game by making a photograph that mirrors the original sketch. My outer layer involves an interest in aesthetics, finds creative solutions to the challenge, and focuses on the notion of emptiness and being with a fleetingness that is analogous to being with someone at the end of their life. And lastly, there's this quote by Marcel Duchamp, which I really love, which is, "What art is in reality is the missing link, not the links which exist. It's not what you see that is art. Art is the gap." And this is where I transition to some awkward early work from graduate school. Because trying to explore that gap's a weird place. And so I was thinking, how can I literally represent it? How can I, this thing I'm really into, this presence and absence, be it a big thing like life and death, or be it balloons going across the sky, where is it? And especially since it's a non-visual thing and photography is a purely visual medium, how can I see it? So I went about thinking about how can I go about accessing this in-between space. This is an image I made a while ago, right after graduate school, and I just laid in a field, and I looked at the sky, and I waited for my body to make an imprint, and then I got in a ladder, and I took a picture of that imprint. This is a smoke ring I blew over my kitchen table in my apartment in Chicago. And this is, I spent a lot of time doing some damage to my right eye. Don't do this. But I would walk through the forest. This was sort of little urban forest in Chicago. I'd go into the woods, and what I'd do is I would try to find a place in which this was possible. And I always thought it was kind of a little accidentally poetic. But the way this would happen, you can't look around in the treescape and find rainbows. But you'd look at the ground, and I'd look for a totally dark place where there was one shaft of light. And I knew that one shaft of light was kind of like a theater where this was maybe going to happen. And I'd stand at that one shaft of light, and I'd point my camera at the sky, and I'd turn the lens, unfortunately looking through it a little bit, doing damage to my right eye, but also just trying to see this moment. And you wouldn't see this, but you'd see this potential. And then, process the film, and either you'd get it or you wouldn't. But at its best, I'd take that one singular shaft of light, and I'd refract it into concentric rainbow circles, which I really appreciated, and in the sense that it sidestepped all the things I'm worried about. In fact, there was no subject. I didn't even have to think about these issues of agency in Photoshop. There wasn't me in the frame, there wasn't an object. It was a totally optically created situation. This is a picture of me making out with myself by the door. In an effort, again, to find a way to convey a presence and absence, I did this gesture of trying to find a way to have an invisible person kissing myself on the way out the door. Part 3, images. So from this point forward, I'll just sort of go through these. Some I'll have more to say about than others, but I'll kind of try to unpack them. And I guess, I've laid out this interest in games. I've laid out this sort of game that I've invented, insofar that there's no Photoshop. I am merely, the camera is merely a witness, and I have to, make this event happen that mirrors this original drawing. And then, the concepts for what inform me are these sort of notions of how to conceptualize and how to visualize presence and absence. And so this is also a fun one, because if I ever show this to a Photo 1 class, there's the inevitable kid who's totally right, and when I say, hey, this took me 4 months and an uncalculable cost of film and processing, and to make this picture, and I would just return to the woods of Chicago over and over again with one balloon with oxygen, one with helium, to create this perfect circuit. And they'd go in the trees, and they'd all these things would go wrong, and then ultimately I got it and be like, you could have made that in Photoshop in 5 minutes. And it'd say, yeah, you can totally make that in Photoshop in 5 minutes. And so the photographs are really important, but like what the thing, I don't know what the thing is, but the thing isn't exactly the photograph. The photograph is the thing I can have here with me. I've sometimes called it a trophy, and I think that's a little too macho. It's not really what I mean, but it's more of a way of communicating it. But the real thing, the real like art for me, is to make the drawing and then to be there in the world and to see it actually happen. And then hopefully you trip the shutter and it becomes a thing. Again, some of these I'll have a lot to say about, some I'll just sort of go over relatively briefly. But this is an image I made. I had a residency. I usually don't work in a white studio. It's not exactly something I have, nor is it something I'm really that interested in. And I had all these sketches as all ready to go for, it was February in New York State, and it was a very soft February, and it was very muddy. And so all my plans were foiled, and I was determined to put this time to good use, so I set myself a schedule. Breakfast early, long bike ride, and then 8 hours in the studio. Even if nothing came of it, I'd feel like I was doing my best. And so I started sort of playing around with materials, and every lunch always came with like a weird apple or a sad banana. And so like I had this little pile of sad bananas that accumulated. And I think from the local Walmart, I had acquired a couple of cocktail umbrellas, and I started messing around. And I just made this little sculptural object in which, it is what it is. One of the cocktail umbrellas is suspending and supporting the banana, and the other one's wedged in the Bic lighter, keeping it burning. And I liked its temporal nature, I liked its ridiculousness, and I liked it also pointed to me outside the frame as the agent of its making. Much to the amusement of my neighbors when I lived in Florida, neighbors that I didn't really meet very often, I made this photograph of making an eclipse. And so the only spot where I could do this on my little postage-sized property was the front yard. And I had this pile of pineapples, and I stood there in this beautiful sky. And about this time, I get them out, and it's just a little weird enough that like you start seeing the Venetian blinds open, you start seeing eyeballs of people you'll never meet looking at you. And so I start throwing these pineapples in the air, and I'm determined to make this picture of an eclipse. I have this drawing of an eclipse of pineapples, and I'm going to make it an image of one. And so the first sort of thing I learned in doing this, I said they're like these little idiosyncratic skill sets I only use once, was like, I don't want to look through the viewfinder of the camera. That makes no sense. Because I could try to visualize this through the viewfinder, it would never work. But what I would do is I would take a pineapple and I would throw it in the air, and I'd wait for the moment where the shadow of that fell in the lens. And the moment when the shadow of that fell in the lens, I knew that it was creating an eclipse of sorts. And so I did that until all the pineapples were broken, and I hoped I had something. And I should say that like I've gotten very like uncompromising, like that the photograph has to perfectly mirror the drawing. I used to be a little more forgiving, I guess. But in this one, it was like one of the few ones where it actually exceeded all expectations. I was expecting the pineapple to be kind of the eclipse to be a black silhouette, where in fact there's some detail, and also I got this like amazing half moon rainbow from the sun refraction around it that made it feel to me like kind of planetary. In this one, my photo assistant Dave and I drove from New York City to northeastern Indiana, and for a solid day, just dropped a cinder block on a 1x6, launching a lawn chair in the air. And I set out with like this very specific idea in mind, right down to materials. Like it couldn't be any lawn chair; it had to be that lawn chair. And I sought, the internet. I sought the actual world like for that lawn chair until I got it, and I knew it the second I saw it. I didn't want the bucket to be, every 5-gallon bucket in the world is sort of, Home Depot orange, and I didn't want that bucket, so I got this like sort of old sunburst yellow, or like canary yellow, I guess, bucket. And then like it wasn't enough just to have the chair go in the air, but I wanted it at its apex, and I kind of wanted to feel as if it was like flying forever. And we had driven all the way out there, and I was determined I was going to get this thing right. And I also realized that two things were happening at once, which was I wanted to make sure I got this right, but also I think I just kept doing it because it was the funniest thing in the world to be with one of your best friends in the middle of the most lonely, expansive field doing this all day long. This is an image where I tried to make a perfect circle of Barbasol shaving cream by mounting it atop a wine glass on a Lazy Susan at a residency where I had run out of better ideas. My daughter was a little younger then, and so I think she'd still dig this. But I'd entertain her in the morning. I did have Wi-Fi, even though it's 13 nautical miles off the coast of Maine on this little island. And I'd put my phone on this Lazy Susan, and I could spin it around. And so, from her perspective, it was just spinning around the room. And so I'd sort of focused in on this as an object I'd never really considered before. And then I put myself in my bedroom in this residency space and tried to see if I could make a circle by spinning this sort of sculptural object on top of the Lazy Susan. This is simply is what it is. I'm using a floor fan to try to emulate the powers of nature. I tried to make the perfect circumference of a little beach umbrella with cocktail umbrellas, and I wanted it to be the exact same size. And so there'll be an outtake of this later, but it was very arduous to put this into this space. And again, with all of them, I guess, as I quickly go through them, I just I hope they're silly. I hope they're light, and I also hope that there's that little hint of the person doing them or the thing outside of the frame. But this one, a friend of mine agreed to help me. He had this big panel van, which we filled with balloons. I blew them up the night before with an air compressor to try to save my lips and cheeks, and wrapped them I made a big taco with a tarp. And we put them in his van with this huge ladder on top and went out to the woods and just proceeded to put them all on the tree with tape. And I should say, when you guys go and see the show, I think a lot of the things I love are because there's no Photoshop or anything, if you get up on this image, you can totally, I tried to hide it, but you can totally see the packing tape. And I had this all set up, the camera's set up, we're going to make the exposure, inevitably the wind would blow a little bit and there'd be a pop. And it was never the one on the bottom, it was always the one way up there, the pink one on the top right. And so get the ladder out and fix it. So there's, I haven't looked at this in a while, completely, but there's usually little details of pop balloons and packing tape and all those little imperfections. I set out to make this splash. This is my apartment when I was living in Florida, and I was talking to a friend and assistant, and I was yeah, I got this dialed in. I've got drinking straws taped across the ceiling. I got a piece of fishing line going through it. I'm going to pull on the fishing line. It's going to pull this pin. It's going to drop a glass ball that I have wrapped in white duct tape. It's going to fall in this exact spot. I've marked the spot with a pencil, and it's going to land in this glass of milk. And it's going to make this splash. I've got some strobe set up, and it's going to be, I thought done, easy. And they said, no, it's just going to break the glass. And I said, no, it's not going to break. Never going to break the glass. And so I do it. I set it all up, and the first ball that drops hits the side of the glass and shatters it. And milk goes everywhere. And milk is, despite the fact that I use milk a fair amount, it's one of my least favorite materials, and I really don't care for it at all. And it also does not clean up well. And so the day I left this apartment, I could still sort of see the consequences of that first one. The good news was the 7 that followed after were beautiful and perfect. And at the end, I just had to choose which of the sort of the shapes of milk was the best. And I like this one because it really reached upward of the ceiling and filled the frame. I drove across the United States. This was a residency I had in Oregon, and I really set out with this one image in mind. And that's not to say I didn't do other things, but for a month, it was almost biblical. I pushed a wheelbarrow around a playa just filled with pinwheels and weird stuff. And I had these sort of things I wanted to have happen. And it was just this complete non-space, this beautiful emptiness that I love so much. But so in order to make this picture, I think I had 54 dominoes, and I'd lay them out. In order to get into the space, I'd have to put down planks of wood, because otherwise there'd be footprints. And there, it's a playa. There's nothing stopping the wind. So the wind would blow, they'd all fall over. The wind would fall, they'd all fall over. And it was only rare that I'd even get them set up. I'd remove the planks of wood, and I would hit them out of frame left and run as fast as I can, which is arguably not that fast, towards my camera, and hit the shutter release and kind of looking over my shoulder. And what I wanted was so specific. Again, it wasn't just it to happen. It had to be out of frame left, exiting out of frame right, and I wanted it to be exactly in the middle at the moment when one was toppling over, where there was no doubt that it was actually happening. And again, I guess I'll go back. I mean, my hope was that like this is an easy image to deconstruct. Like without me telling the story, you pretty much can figure it out. But if you're willing to sort of suspend disbelief a little bit, I hope that you can think like maybe it's also going on forever, though, even though that's probably unlikely. This is my parents' 1981 Eureka vacuum cleaner running on a frozen lake in Maine. Sometimes with materials, I think like, what else can they do? So this is an image where I wanted to have milk both be collected and fill a glass, be absorbed by a sponge, and extinguish a small fire that was made with a box of matches. I had the best landlord ever in Chicago who charged me very reasonable rent and did not raise it when he could have. And amongst the other great things he did for me, when there was an empty apartment unit, he would give me like the keys to it. And so, which was huge, because otherwise, up until that point, I'd have to take all my things and push them from one side of my small apartment to the other to create said empty space. And so this was, during this time, and I was going into these empty apartments and just trying to make things happen, usually involving, I was like kind of chasing this idea of making this shaft of light. And initially, I guess I kind of wanted you not to see the apparatus, the flashlights, and then I realized that was not possible, so I kind of embraced them. And so it is what it is. I bottom lit 2 like large, forget what they are, green bottled beers. I always love that color. And then perched atop them are 2 more flashlights. I filled the room lightly with some particulates from a smoke machine to make the shaft of light. And then, again, chasing these things down. This was like one of my my COVID photos, in the sense that I think I started the pandemic with it, and I just finally realized it last summer. I shot this in so many different locations, and it was so hard. To get a balloon just to hover. I mean, the tricks I've learned over the years on that little thing is like enough to be ridiculous. But then not only that, like I had to have it surrounded by 4 Bic lighters that are wedged open with cocktail umbrellas. But as soon as there's anything moving, like me breathing, me entering the space, HVAC turns on, like it's all a mess. So this ended up being in our home in New Jersey. I turned off HVAC. I didn't realize this, but even with HVAC off, the fan went on intermittently every 15 minutes. Put taped some plastic sheeting over that, and I finally get in there. I'm at year like 2.5 of the pandemic, year 2.5, and like me entering the space is messing it up. Me breathing is messing it up. I got my T-shirt over my mouth, and I'm thinking, if there was just one thing I could do to like cover my mouth and keep my breath from making this balloon move, and for these Bic lighters blowing out, I wish I had that thing. And then I was like, oh yeah, like the mask I've had in my pocket for the last 2.5 years would be super. So I put the mask on, and it made things a lot better, and it went pretty smoothly after that. This was from that residency where it never snowed. It did in fact snow one time, and I had laid out this sort of infrastructure of this photograph beforehand. So this isn't the exhibition. This is sort of one that's, I think it's kind of easy to walk past and be like, meh. And I should say, I don't want, like I sort of say these things, but I don't want them to feel heavy or arduous, or I don't want all the mechanics of them to become, competing. But to do this before it snowed, I had to plant these 3 huge tree limbs in the ground. So I dug holes, put them in the ground. I made a fire. I then put a piece of plastic sheeting over it so snow would not fall on it if it was to snow. I was hoping it would. And then I put these holiday lights around with zip ties so they wouldn't fall on these 3 posts I had planted. And I ran electricity then outside the frame. And then I patiently waited for it to snow. I put a note up for my colleagues at the residency to not come and put their footprints in it, because that would really be a bummer. And then finally it snowed, and so I ran into the space. I had this big long stick. I removed the plastic sheeting to find, my fire had been laid. I fired up a generator, my lights went on. And then I took a long stick with a plastic cup, put some white gas on it, and lit it on fire so that my footprints would not be in the frame. I then took said stick on fire, ignited it, and then just simply sat there and waited as the sun set. So as this exact sort of point where the sun's going down, but the sun's going down, but there's still enough ambient light to see the forest. This is a floor fan blowing a helium balloon on the Outer Banks of Cape Cod. This is a laser with a hole dug underneath it, so it's being bottom lit with a flashlight with a laser going by. This is a half gallon of milk going across the Midwest on a skateboard. All right, this is the last one. I guess I'll kind of deconstruct a little. I'll show some outtakes and stuff. But so this was another one. This was like that sort of defined my pandemic experience, and I was really psyched that I think we've talked a lot about this as a family. This was definitely in Michigan. My spouse was there, and my daughter Juniper. My daughter Juniper, I know, actually took this picture. But so we had this all set up, and I did this over and over again. But so what we have is a burning ring. So what it is a bicycle wheel that I wrapped a piece of hemp rope around. And so there's this piece of hemp rope wrapped in, dipped in white gas, and I'd light that on fire. And then as soon as that's lit, what I'd have laid out is I had a Barbasol shaving cream container perched slightly upward. And if you look at the print, I believe what's there is a Bic lighter, so it's got a slight upward tilt to it. And then I had watched a YouTube video made by an 11-year-old child on how to modify a shaving cream container so it shoots further. I believe they were having like shaving cream wars or something like that. And I sat dutifully taking notes because this was the information I totally needed to make this photograph. And so I had basically inserted a little pin in this and melted it to make the valve smaller. I then had done a variety of tests. Measurements were made, winds were accounted for, and so as soon as you then run from the burning ring back to the Barbasol, you have to take a piece of packing tape and depress the button with a die. And you have to also have it can't go everywhere. It has to immediately pass effortlessly through this burning ring because I don't allow myself the luxury of things like digital augmentation. So, we tried again, and ultimately this one, I performed this bizarre array of tasks and yelled, "Now," as I got a frame, and Juniper pushed the shutter button, making this photo. So process and outtakes, I'm just going to show a few of these things, sort of images made along the way, little outtakes and stuff. This was the one made involving the series of cocktail umbrellas and the beach umbrella. This is my spouse and assistant, Kate, who's helped me with so many things I can't even tell you. She was also extremely sick when she did this, which made it even nicer. We climbed over a series of sand dunes and carried a lot of things. But it was amazing because we had to figure out a way in which to get into this frame without any footprints. And so the solution was this long ladder and a couple of milk crates. And Kate came up with the ingenious idea. She had this very special piece of grass she used. And if there was any imperfections or something fell, she was able to sort of remove them. It was almost like the Photoshop clone stamp tool, but it was like grass on actual sand. This is an outtake from Juniper and Kate helping me making the one that's also in the exhibition down the hall, where we made an umbrella levitate using, I don't know, it was like 60 some odd helium balloons. And so we sat, there was a moment right before a bunch of things. Kate had to travel. We were very busy. It was the pandemic. And I woke up and there was this moment where there was absolutely no breeze. It was just perfect. And I knew we kind of had to move fast because as soon as you're taking balloons outside and like relying on there being no atmospheric changes, you really like 1 mile an hour winds will like ruin everything. So we shot up and immediately got out there and were able to make an umbrella levitate with, I forget what it was, like 60 something helium balloons. This is my friend Dave. Dave has made so many photographs and done so many ridiculous things at this point, I can't even tell you. This is also like a testament to what a great friend Dave is. You can't see this. This is, we're on a lake that's got about 1.5 inches of ice. But that's not stopping Dave from getting on top of that ladder. Dave said, no problem. And I said, you got to throw this thing that's on fire. I gave him an oven mitt. And he said, that's okay. And that's Dave with his hand on fire on 1.5 inches of ice. With his hand on fire, yeah, throwing a I believe it was a tennis ball lid on fire. These are a couple of outtakes from the infamous shoot of trying to make the photograph of the levitating chair on the plains of the Midwest. And we goaded each other afterwards. So we both had brown shoes that day, and one of us was slow. We each kind of blamed the other a little bit. I'm sure it was actually me. I'm not as fast as other people, but so it would take turns. I guess I should say also it's not like important, whether I'm operating the camera or whether I'm actually making the thing happen. So with assistants I've worked with, especially those I've worked with a lot, those two roles kind of get changed frequently. This is from the outtake from trying to make the umbrella levitate, where clearly I did not get out of the frame fast enough. And mostly what it is things breaking and falling apart. And so this is an image of trying to, on the left, of trying to transfer a gallon of milk through a series of vessels and end up in another gallon of milk, which seems kind of poetic and wonderful in the image on the right, but when in fact it's usually after many instances of the one on the left. And lastly is this image, several years back, my spouse and I bought a house, and I think my parents took that as an opportunity to give me some things I should have taken a long time ago. I was looking through some old stuff, what to keep, what to get rid of, and I had these early boxes of photographs I had made in like a class in like the 5th grade. And I looked through them, I was like, well, I'll be. And like there was a photograph I had made, whereas fifth grade me was running around my front yard of the house I grew up in, trying to both throw and then photograph a paper airplane. And then only couple years later is the image I made on the right. Totally actually had forgotten and unaware of that fact by then, where I actually succeeded in making an image of the paper airplane with the sky behind it. So through the process, I'd say, if nothing else, I've achieved a greater aptitude for photographing paper airplanes. And that is it. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any, but thank you. Yes.
I'd like to know how many paper airplanes did you have to throw to get that shot?
It was at the end of a dock, and so I wasn't expecting any of them to go again. They mostly went in the water, and it was 3 brown bags of paper airplanes I made. I remember the 3 brown bags, and they were just filled. Many a paper airplane.
What would you say your success rate is for things that make it to like a drawing on the wall? Are you batting 1,000 for getting a photograph that you're happy with at the end, or is it lower than that? I mean, it's like the same answer. Like when I do a lot of bicycle touring, and people ask me what my bike weighs, and I say I just don't want to know. I would never be able to guess, but it's like so low it would not be something I'm proud of. Because they fail both. Like there's things that like they seem great as a sketch and they just don't work as a photograph, and then there's ones that for whatever such reason just like cannot be actualized. So I mean I'd say I'm operating at about a 9% success rate if I was to really think about it maybe.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm curious about your choice of objects.
Yeah.
Like, I like that the objects sort of become characters. So there's the balloons and the cigarette lighters and I'm just wondering if there's any sort of symbolism behind them, or it's just what strikes your fancy as being whimsical and.
Yeah,
Why Barbasol as
Why
opposed
Barbasol,
to
right.
some other kind of shaving cream or whatever.
That was a technical test. It actually traveled the furthest through the air on Barbasol, which, although I was very attracted to their 100th anniversary can, which was perfect. I don't know. And I've thought about this at times, because like one of the things I'm aware of is like a lot of the things I dislike the most, like disposable plastics and stuff, I use the most in my art. So a lot of the things that like I try to use minimally in life, I really gravitate towards in art. I think balloons are amazing. I remember like in church as a kid, like I didn't go to church for that long, but we watched that movie, The Red Balloon. And it was like an easy sort of stand-in for a person. I also had an amazing dog, and he hated only a few things, and it was like figurative sculpture, people not like moving that stood in the periphery, or balloons. Like he saw them as things. So I think there's something about a balloon. They're fun, they're colorful, they're great. They're temperamental, and they're also just sort of easy to anthropomorphize. So I don't have a one answer, but like, it's also a sort of, I know it when I see it. Like when I went to get a roller skate, I scoured roller skates forever to find those roller skates. And there was a lot of roller skates that like just weren't the one. So there was one that had like a rightness after all the other ones that just didn't make it.
I'm wondering if there are, or if there has been a drawing that you did that you really loved that is impossible to become a photograph, or if there's some that you felt were impossible, but you got to give it the old college try anyway, right. That you kind of defied your own expectations and it became a photograph that you were happy with.
That's a good one. there's definitely the one of the eclipse, whereas like it exceeded all expectations in a way that I was not prepared for, because that never happens. Like that's the gift I tend not to receive. I mean, I'm okay with that relationship with like the universe, but that never happens. There's some that like, for technical reasons, will never be realized. Like just the physics that like I went into it. Like everything from 30,000 feet seems so easy. Like, oh, I'll do this and it'll work. And then you find yourself like, 2 years later on your knees trying again. You're like, this is never gonna happen. So there's some, nothing like leaps to mind specifically. But I also, there's categories of them. I was sort of thinking about this, and I kind of should have said it when I was talking about, that are like all these different kinds of seeing. Like when I made the one of like the disco ball, for example, like it was this like kind of profound experience in the woods that was like equal to the photograph. Whereas a lot of them are like things you can't see. Like the eclipse, I couldn't see it until it was a photograph, right? Like it was the photograph that allowed me even to see its possibility. I realize I'm kind of sidestepping your question because I don't exactly have a perfect answer for it. But yeah, I mean, there are some that will never be realized. And I think for the most part, it's mostly just my understanding of physics does not marry up with the world on that situation.
I guess I was wondering, because you, in this discussion, you talked about realizing the drawings with the images, but you don't present the two together.
Right.
And can you explain why? I mean, why that decision not to do that?
Yeah, I guess, for a while I didn't even tell this degree of background story, and I guess I'm sort of over that. But I never wanted it to be like an illustration, like, or I never wanted to give it away. I feel like maybe I've almost given it away a little bit too much right now, which is, I'm cool with it, it's fine. But like, I wouldn't want it just to be like, the photograph illustrates the drawing, or vice versa, the drawing illustrates the photograph. Like, I think it's sort of, I don't think it would add to anything. I think if anything, it might sort of subtract from the potential, like, I'll say lowercase t transcendence of one of them. Like, it would sort of like, it would be like knowing the punchline before the joke, or it just wouldn't work. So I'm sorry to take this and ask myself my own question, but like, I've made videos occasionally, and people say like, why not video? And I've been asked that a lot. I really love that a photograph can show just like the one moment of success. And in all of them, a video would just reveal the trajectory of it being failure, failure, failure. You can kind of imagine here, and it like falls on the floor. So the photograph alone without a drawing is just, I can show it at zenith, and I think, it really asks the viewer, like, do you want to deconstruct this? It's so easy to. This is obviously a thing he just did, or you can entertain the possible notion of maybe that lawn chair is going on forever. Maybe those dominoes are just going infinitely across a desert. And so it's like, it's yeah, I guess it's that. Okay. I hope that sort of answered it.
Do you keep the drawings?
I do keep the drawings in the least precious of ways, like in my barn in a box. Like when it came time for this exhibition, I actually had to ask myself that question because I didn't know the answer. I'm sure many have been lost over the years, but yeah, they're, like a lot of notebooks sort of travel through different spaces. I don't think of them as, again, as precious or as things I like. I guess I don't think of them as art. I think of them as research. So they're treated well, but they're in a box in a barn that's by no means air conditioned, or humidity is regulated. But they're there.
How are you so cool?
Oh.
I don't even know how to begin to answer that, Juniper. Thank you very much for that softball of a question. I should go out. That's. Please join me, down the hall for the exhibition. And I should say that, 3 of the most prolific and profound photo assistants are here. Kate, right there. Juniper in the back with a wonderful question. There she is. And Dave, where's Dave? There's Dave. So, they've been there through like all of the sort of the nuts and bolts and the failure and successes. So they can also answer tons of questions about this stuff. So also reach out to those guys. And thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.